Next we're going to pin our cuff in place. We're taking one piece of the cuff and pinning it to the inside of the sleeve to begin with. And again, I'm leaving a 1/2 inch seam allowance sticking off the edges of the sleeve placket. So I've got the stitch line of the cuff lined up with the edge of the sleeve placket so that when I attach the other side of my cuff, my finished edges will match up. And now we have the cuff. You can see there's a 1/2 inch seam allowance sticking beyond where the edge of the placket is. And I'm stitching a straight stitch. I'm stitching a piece of the cuff to the inside or wrong side of the shirt sleeve to begin with. And I'll do that on both sides with a 1/2 inch excess over the edge on the front, and then I'll stitch at a 1/2 inch on the inside of the sleeve to the other placket and end with a back tack. And now I'm taking the cuff and I'm folding it open and folding the seam allowance up so that I can match the other side, and I just want to sew the cuff pieces. I don't want to catch the placket of the sleeve, but I'm going to sew the bottom 3 corners of the cuff. So again, I'm pressing it open, I'm pressing the seam allowance up, and I'm matching the cuff pieces together, and I'm going to sew the 2 short sides and the bottom. So we'll begin with the cuff, and you can see that I've just got the 2 pieces of cuff material. I'm not catching the placket here, and I'm stitching down at a 1/2 inch. I'm twisting at 45 to do a single stitch, and then going down the bottom edge of the cuff, again setting my needle, pivoting 45 degrees for a miter corner edge, and then coming up, just getting the 2 pieces of cuff and ending with a back tack. So on the other side I'll do the same thing. Begin with a back tack, come down to my first corner, pivot my fabric 45 degrees, and then finish my straight stitch, coming to the other corner, pivoting my needle, and then coming up the final short edge, careful not to catch the placket and only catch the pieces of cuff material. And then for our cuff, we're going to go ahead and cut the corners off to reduce bulk, and then we'll flip them right sides out. And then when we tuck our seam allowance down into the cuff, it creates this natural roll on the last open edge that we have for our cuff. So we'll pin it in place and we'll stitch in the ditch on it as well, making sure that the top stitch that we do covers our previous stitch, and then we have our beautiful cuffs finished up. So I'll get the corners turned out nice and pretty, and then I'll start pinning this in place to make sure that it has no puckers as I close up the cuff. And now I'll do the same thing on the other side, cutting off the corners to reduce bulk. Makes it easier for those to be turned right side out. And then once we turn our corners out, we'll be able to fold all of our seam allowance down into the cuff itself, which will create a little roll in our seam allowance of our cuff piece to top stitch or stitch in the ditch closed. So again, I'm making sure that my fabric is rolled over and covering up the previous stitch that's underneath where I attach the cuff from the other side or the wrong side. And then when I top stitch on the right side, it will be beautifully in place. And I'm going to go ahead and lace up the back of my blouse while I'm at it. So I've got a bodkin that's helping me pull the rest of my spaghetti through all of my bias loops that I made earlier. And now I'm just pulling the lacing through. So here is stitching the cuff closed. Again, I'm just doing a 1/16 inch edge stitch all along that cuff so that I've got a stitch in the ditch on the other side, and on the face or right side of the garment I have a pretty detailed 1/16 top stitch. So I'm keeping that left edge of the fabric lined up with the inner left edge of the presser foot. And here you can see our beautiful plackets are finished up. They align very nicely on our tuxedo inset. I am going to trim up. One side was a little bit longer, but I'm going to trim that up, and now I'm going to take my collar and I'm going to cut off this corner to reduce the bulk when we turn our collar to the right sides. And now I'm going to go ahead and flip my collar so that it is right sides out. And I'm going to put the right side of one collar stand piece to the inside or wrong side of the shirt. I'm going to attach to the collar to the wrong side first so that I'm top stitching on the right side. So I'm matching up the notches with the shoulder seams and the center front of the shirt with the center front of the collar on both edges. And now we're going to start with the collar. So for the back side or inside of the collar, I'm going to start at the very center front and back tack down all the seam allowance. And then I'm just keeping the seam allowances consistent at a 1/2 inch and going from pin to pin and making sure I don't have any puckers or weird gathers or anything shifting and pinching where it shouldn't be. And as I get to center back, I have to set my needle in and readjust my angle so that I can come up the other side. But I'm making sure my seam allowances are going the same direction on the underside, and I'm making sure that the seam allowance for the stitch that I'm stitching is consistent at a 1/2 inch. So here you can see our beautiful collar, and now we're going to fold over the right side, and I'm starting at the center back and I'm pinning my collar in place for a stitch in the ditch, and now I'm going to center front and I'm pinning it in place right over my previous stitch, and now I'm just zhuzhing in the rest of the fabric and making sure that everything lays pretty, free of puckers, and that it's set up just over top of my previous stitch so that I can stitch in the ditch to close off my garment. So I'll go to the other side center front and make sure that it's turned in nice and pretty and pinned in place, and then I'll just ease the rest of the fabric in where it needs to be so that we don't have any puckers or any weird rolling or distortions from our collar, and making sure that it's folded over just over top of the previous stitch so that everything will be hidden. And now we'll top stitch our collar in place with the same method, keeping the left edge of the collar stand butted up against the left inside edge of the presser foot. And I'm just going from pin to pin and making sure everything is in place and making sure I don't have any puckers or don't have seam allowance exposed, and then I have a nice pretty continuous seam all the way across my collar stand. And now you can see our beautiful top stitching is all done. So we'll match up the fronts, and there's our beautiful blouse. OMG, you did it. Great job.